I was the poor cousin at the wedding until the groom's father recognized me. My wealthy relatives spent the entire wedding mocking my cheap suit and failed career. During the toast, the groom's father, a CEO I'd saved from a bad merger, publicly thanked me for being his mentor. The look on my aunt's face when she realized I held their mortgage was the ultimate justice. I knew I didn't belong the moment my aunt looked at my suit before she looked at my face. It was a small thing, just a flicker in her eyes. But I've spent my whole life reading rooms like that. The wedding venue smelled like white roses and polished wood. Crystal chandeliers hung low over round tables dressed in ivory linen, and waiters moved silently with silver trays balanced on their palms. My cousin Daniel had chosen well. Or rather, his fiancée's family had. Everything about the place whispered money, old money, the kind that doesn't check price tags. I stood near the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of the only suit I owned. It wasn't new, it wasn't designer. It was navy, slightly shiny at the elbows, tailored 10 years ago when I thought I'd need it for investor meetings that never materialized. I'd pressed it myself that morning in my small apartment, the hiss of steam filling the kitchen while my coffee went cold. "Ethan?" Aunt Lorraine's voice cut through the string quartet like a paper slice. She approached with air kisses and perfume that smelled expensive and overwhelming. Her eyes swept over me again, slower this time. "Oh," she said lightly, smoothing her pearl necklace. "You made it? I wouldn't miss it," I replied, smiling. Behind her, I caught snippets of whispers. "He's still doing that consulting thing, right? I heard his startup failed. Such a shame. He was always the smart one." The poor cousin, the cautionary tale. It hadn't always been like this. Growing up, I was the kid who fixed broken radios for fun, the one teachers called gifted. My uncle once told everyone at Thanksgiving that I'd be the first millionaire in the family. But life isn't a straight line. My first company folded during a recession. Investors pulled out. I covered employee salaries from my savings before finally shutting the doors. I never told my family the details. Pride, maybe, or exhaustion. After that, I pivoted quietly into advisory work, helping struggling businesses restructure, renegotiate debt, survive. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't make headlines, but it paid the bills. It kept the lights on, just not in a way that impressed anyone who measured worth by cars and country club memberships. Daniel spotted me from across the room and waved. "Ethan, man, you made it!" He hugged me hard, genuine, warm. For a moment, the noise faded. "I'm glad you're here. Dad's running late, but he'll want to see you." I nodded, though I wasn't sure why his father would care. Mr. Harrison, Richard Harrison, was a CEO with his name on business magazines. He owned the kind of smile that came with press conferences and shareholder meetings. I'd met him once, briefly, at the engagement party. A handshake, a polite nod, nothing memorable, or so I thought. I found my seat at table 14, near the back, close to the kitchen doors. My place card leaned slightly to the left, as if even it wasn't sure it belonged there. Across from me sat my cousin Marissa and her husband Glenn. Marissa gave me a sympathetic smile. "I like the suit," she said softly. Glenn chuckled. "Vintage is in, right?" I laughed with them. What else was there to do? The ceremony was beautiful. Daniel's voice trembled when he said his vows. His bride, Leela, wiped tears with careful fingers so she wouldn't smudge her makeup. People clapped. Someone sniffled loudly, and for a moment I let myself forget the subtle glances, the sideways comments. At dinner, the wine flowed freely. Aunt Lorraine leaned over from the adjacent table. "So, Ethan," she began, her tone coated in artificial sweetness, "are you still between ventures?" I took a slow sip of water, calmly. "I run a restructuring advisory firm, mostly mergers and distressed acquisitions." "Oh," she replied, blinking. "That sounds complicated." Glenn leaned back in his chair. Translation, he tells companies how to fire people. A few people laughed. I smiled. Sometimes I tell them how not to go bankrupt. Another laugh, thinner this time. I've learned something over the years. When people underestimate you, they reveal more about themselves than they ever intend to. Still, the words lingered. Between ventures. Failed. Such a shame. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate lemon tart with edible gold flakes, I felt like I'd been gently, politely carved down to size. Then the band quieted. A spoon tapped against a champagne glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, "the father of the groom would like to say a few words." A ripple of attention moved through the room. Richard Harrison stepped onto the small stage, adjusting his cufflinks beneath the warm lights. He looked every inch an economic executive, tailored tuxedo, silver hair perfectly in place. He began with the expected things: how proud he was, how Daniel had grown into a fine man, how Leela was now a cherished daughter. People nodded, smiled, dabbed their eyes. Then his gaze shifted. It scanned the room slowly until it landed on me, and he smiled in a way that made my stomach tighten. "There's someone here tonight," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion, "without whom I wouldn't be standing here as Daniel's father." A murmur spread through the tables. I felt heat rise to my neck. "I hope he'll forgive me for putting him on the spot," Richard continued, lifting his glass slightly. "But Ethan? Would you please stand up?" Every head turned. My aunt's fork froze halfway to her mouth. For a split second, I considered pretending I hadn't heard him. But I stood, and in that silence, thick, confused, expectant, I realized something was about to change. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet. It's strange how sound sharpens in moments like that. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the clink of someone setting down a wine glass too quickly, a chair leg scraping against polished wood. Richard Harrison looked at me as if we were the only two people in the room. "5 years ago," he began, "my company was about to make the biggest mistake of my career." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the guests. They thought it was self-deprecating humor. It wasn't. We were preparing for a merger that looked perfect on paper. The projections were strong. The press was already drafting headlines. He paused, but something felt off. His eyes didn't leave mine. I hired an independent advisor to review the deal, someone with no interest in impressing my board, someone young enough to be underestimated and smart enough not to care. A few heads turned toward me again. My palms felt damp. He walked into my office with a legal pad instead of a presentation deck. 3 days later, he told me to walk away from a $2 billion merger. Gasps. Actual audible gasps. He showed me what my own team had missed: hidden liabilities, inflated assets, a ticking bomb disguised as opportunity. The room had gone completely still. If I had signed that deal, we would have collapsed within 18 months. Thousands of employees would have lost their jobs. My family would have lost everything. He lifted his glass toward me. That advisor was Ethan. The silence broke into scattered applause, uncertain at first, then building. I stood there, heat rising behind my eyes, wishing I could disappear, and yet unable to move. Richard's voice softened. He didn't just save my company, he saved my family's stability. He refused a public acknowledgement because he said, and I quote, "The work matters more than the credit." A few people actually turned in their chairs now, studying me as if I had transformed. "And tonight," Richard added, "I want to correct that." The applause grew louder. I caught sight of Aunt Lorraine. Her face had drained of color. Glenn looked like someone had swapped his wine for vinegar. Richard stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward my table. Every step felt exaggerated, cinematic. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, quietly so only I could hear, "for telling me the truth when it would have been easier to tell me what I wanted to hear." I shook his hand. "You did the hard part," I replied. "You listened." He smiled, then louder for everyone. "Ethan now advises several of our portfolio companies. Frankly, I consider him one of the sharpest minds I've ever worked with." More applause. I sat down slowly, my ears ringing. Marissa leaned toward me, whispering, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I gave a small shrug. No one asked. That was the truth. For years, I'd watched my relatives equate success with visibility, with cars parked in driveways, vacations posted online. My work happened in conference rooms without windows, in spreadsheets reviewed at 2 a.m., in conversations where I had to tell CEOs their instincts were wrong. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Dinner resumed, though the energy had shifted completely. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly found reasons to stop by my table. "That was incredible, Ethan. You must be doing very well. We should catch up sometime," I answered, politely, calmly. Across the room, Aunt Lorraine whispered furiously to her husband. I could read her lips. "Why didn't we know? How much is he making? Advises portfolio companies?" I almost laughed. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years ago, when Uncle Robert's real estate investments had begun to wobble, he'd called me quietly, not for advice, for a short-term bridge loan. He sounded embarrassed. "It's just paperwork timing. 3 months tops." I didn't hesitate. I wired the funds personally through a holding structure so it wouldn't become family gossip. What they never realized was that the paperwork timing turned into refinancing, and that refinancing came through a firm I controlled. Technically, I didn't hold their mortgage in my own name, but my company serviced the debt. When payments came in each month, I saw the account. I never mentioned it. It wasn't leverage. It was simply business. But watching Aunt Lorraine's expression now, that slow, dawning calculation, I suspected she was beginning to connect dots. Richard returned to the stage to finish his toast, but the damage, or perhaps the correction, had already been done. For the rest of the evening, no one commented on my suit. No one asked if I was between ventures. Instead, I saw something else in their eyes. Recalibration. But as the band struck up a slower song and couples drifted to the dance floor, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, just a quiet, almost weary sadness, because the only thing that had changed was their perception of me, not who I was, not what I'd done, and that realization stung more than the mockery ever had.
The rest of the reception unfolded like a play where someone had quietly rewritten my role. I was no longer the background character, the cautionary Kale seated near the kitchen doors. Now people angled their chairs toward me. They laughed a little too loudly at my mildest jokes. Even the waiter refilled my glass before I asked. It was subtle, but I felt it. Status had shifted. And yet, inside, I felt strangely detached from it all. I stepped outside onto the terrace to get some air. The night was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. The music drifted through the open doors, muffled bass and the soft swell of a love song. I leaned against the railing and let my shoulders relax. "You always disappear when things get loud." Richard's voice came from behind me. I turned. He had loosened his bow tie and looked less like a CEO now, more like a father who had just watched his son get married. "I'm more comfortable in the background," I admitted. He joined me at the railing. "You never were." We stood in silence for a moment. "I meant what I said in there," he continued. "You saved us, and I've regretted not acknowledging it publicly sooner." "I didn't owe you that," I said. "No," he agreed, "but integrity deserves light." The words settled between us. After a pause, he added, "Daniel doesn't know the full story. I kept it contained at the board level, but he will. I want him to understand what real counsel looks like." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Compliments have always made me uncomfortable, especially when they carry weight. Through the glass doors, I could see Aunt Lorraine scanning the terrace. When her eyes locked onto us, she hesitated, then squared her shoulders and stepped outside. Her heels clicked sharply against the stone. "Richard," she said brightly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "That was a surprise." Richard turned politely. "Lorraine, I had no idea Ethan was involved in something so significant." Her gaze shifted to me. There was something new there now. Not warmth, not quite respect, calculation. "I keep my work private," I said evenly. "Yes," she replied. "You were always modest." There it was again, that faint edge. Richard excused himself to greet another guest, leaving the two of us alone beneath the string lights. Lorraine folded her arms lightly, as if bracing against a chill. "You know," she began, lowering her voice, "family shares things. We celebrate each other's successes." "I didn't realize my career required celebration," I said gently. She exhaled through her nose. "Don't be difficult, Ethan. We worried about you." I almost smiled at that. "Did you?" "Of course. After your business setback." The word hung between us like a stain. "It wasn't a setback. It was a lesson." She looked at me more closely then, as if searching for something she hadn't seen before. "And now?" she asked. "You're doing well?" I held her gaze. "I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she shifted, tone softening, strategically. "Robert mentioned refinancing our properties last year," she said casually. "He said the firm handling it was discreet." I felt the subtle pivot. "Yes," I replied. "We specialize in discretion." Her eyes sharpened. "You?" asked she. "My company structured the deal. It made sense. You needed flexibility." The silence that followed was different from the one during Richard's toast. This one was personal. "You're servicing our mortgage?" she asked, almost whispering. "Our firm is," I corrected. Her lips parted slightly. For the first time that evening, she looked uncertain. "And you never thought to mention that at Sunday dinners?" she pressed. It wasn't relevant to Sunday dinner. A faint flush crept up her neck. "You could have said something," she insisted. "We might have approached you differently." The honesty of that slipped out before she could stop it. I studied her face, the careful makeup, the pearl earrings, the tight composure. "That's exactly why I didn't," I said softly. Her jaw tightened. Inside, the band erupted in applause for the couple's first dance. The crowd cheered, pulling attention away from us. Lorraine straightened her shoulders again, the mask sliding back into place. "Well," she said briskly, "I suppose we're all full of surprises. Some of us just don't advertise them," I replied. She gave a thin smile and returned inside. I remained on the terrace, watching through the glass as Daniel twirled Leela beneath the lights. Their laughter looked effortless, untouched by the subtle power shifts happening at the edges of the room. And I wondered something that surprised even me. Had I kept my silence out of humility, or for fear that if they saw my success, they'd treat me exactly like this?
By the time the cake was cut and the speeches wound down, the wedding had split into two separate currents. On the dance floor, there was joy, champagne laughter, high heels kicked off under tables, Daniel spinning his new wife like they were the only two people alive. And around the edges, near the bar and the terrace doors, there was something quieter, conversations that lowered when I passed. Glances that lasted half a second too long, curiosity disguised as casual interest. I'd seen this before in boardrooms, the recalculation phase. Uncle Robert approached me just as I was reaching for my coat. He looked older than I remembered. The last year had carved faint lines around his mouth. He held his drink carefully, as if it might spill a truth he wasn't ready to say. "Ethan," he began, clearing his throat. "Can we talk?" "Of course." We stepped aside near a tall arrangement of white orchids. "I didn't realize," he said slowly, "that your firm handled the restructuring." "I didn't think it was necessary to make it personal," I replied. He nodded, but his eyes were searching. "Lorraine feels blindsided." I almost smiled at the phrasing. "It was a standard financial arrangement," I said. "Your properties were over-leveraged. The market shifted. We provided a solution. You could have taken control," he said quietly. "You had the leverage." There it was, the fear beneath the pride. "I could have," I admitted, "but I didn't." He studied me then, as if reassessing not just my career, but my character. "Why?" he asked. Because I remembered being 12 years old at his dinner table, listening to him boast about my science fair trophy. Because when my father died, he was the one who drove 3 hours to sit beside me at the hospital. Because family, even imperfect family, still mattered. But I didn't say all that. Instead, I answered simply, because business doesn't have to be cruel. His shoulders sagged slightly, not in defeat, but in relief. "I owe you an apology," he said after a moment, "for underestimating you." The words were quiet, Earnest. Accepted, I replied. Across the room, I caught sight of Aunt Lorraine speaking to Marissa. Her posture was rigid, her smile tight. For someone who curated perfection so carefully, tonight had introduced something unpredictable. Not scandal, not disgrace, just truth. And truth has a way of rearranging power without raising its voice. As the evening drew to a close, Richard found me again. I hope tonight didn't make things uncomfortable, he said. It clarified things, I answered. He chuckled softly. Daniel wants you at the family brunch tomorrow. He says any man who can scare his father out of a $2 billion mistake deserves pancakes. I laughed for the first time that evening. A real laugh. I'll be there. When I finally stepped outside to leave, the night air felt cooler than before. The valet brought my car. A modest sedan, clean but unremarkable. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Same suit, same face. Same man who had walked in hours earlier. But something inside me had shifted. Not because they now saw me differently, but because I realized I no longer needed them to. For years, a small part of me had braced for their judgment, measured myself against their visible wealth, wondered if maybe I had in fact fallen short. Tonight stripped that illusion away. Success isn't always loud. Integrity rarely is. I started the engine and pulled away from the glowing venue, watching it shrink in the distance. My phone buzzed at a red light. A message from Daniel. Thank you for being there tonight. Dad told me more. I had no idea. I'm proud to have you as my cousin. I read it twice before replying. Always here for you. That's what family does. And for the first time in a long while, the word family didn't feel complicated. The following weeks were quieter. Lorraine's tone at Sunday dinner softened. Not warm, but careful. Glenn asked for my opinion on a potential investment. Marissa treated me exactly as she always had, which I appreciated more than she knew. No grand apologies, no dramatic confrontations, just a subtle rebalancing. Respect, when earned quietly, tends to last longer. But the real shift wasn't in them, it was in me. I stopped shrinking my accomplishments to make others comfortable. I stopped laughing off dismissive comments. I stopped mistaking humility for invisibility. And strangely, the more grounded I became, the less I needed anyone's approval.
The Sunday brunch felt different. Same long oak table at Aunt Lorraine's house, same floral centerpiece she refreshed every week, same porcelain plates that had survived 3 generations. But something in the air had shifted, like a room after a storm has passed. I arrived 5 minutes early, as I always did. Lorraine opened the door herself this time. "Ethan," she said, and her voice was measured, almost thoughtful. "Come in." No scanning glance at my clothes, no tight smile, just space. The kitchen smelled of butter and coffee. Robert stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, apron slightly crooked. He looked up when I entered. "There he is," he said, "the man who terrifies CEOs. I laughed. I prefer encourages caution. Daniel and Lila were already seated, hands intertwined beneath the table. Newlyweds carry a certain light around them, everything still soft, untested. Daniel stood and pulled out the chair beside him for me. "I've been thinking about what Dad said," he began, once everyone was seated. "About the merger, about you." I braced myself for admiration, for more of that recalibration. Instead, he surprised me. "I realized something," he said. "I've spent most of my life chasing what looks impressive. Promotions, bonuses, visible wins. But Dad told me you walked away from publicity, from credit." He hesitated, then added, "That takes confidence I'm not sure I have yet." The table fell quiet. Lorraine set down the coffee pot a little too carefully. "It wasn't about confidence," I said slowly. "It was about clarity. When you know why you're doing something, you don't need applause." Lila squeezed Daniel's hand. Robert nodded, almost to himself. For years, I had felt like the outsider at this table, the unpredictable variable, the one whose path didn't fit neatly into conversation. But now, no one was measuring me. They were listening, and I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. After brunch, Lorraine asked if I could stay a moment.
We stood alone in the dining room while the others carried dishes to the kitchen. She adjusted the edge of the tablecloth, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't exist. "I owe you something more than politeness," she said finally. I waited. "When Robert told me about the refinancing last year, I was embarrassed. I didn't like needing help." Her jaw tightened slightly. "And I think I projected that onto you. It was easier to label you as struggling than to admit we were." There it was. Not dramatic, not tearful, just honest. "I never saw it as leverage," I said slowly. "It was business and family." She nodded slowly. "I've spent my life believing security comes from appearance, the right schools, the right friends, the right narrative." Her eyes met mine. "You built yours differently." "I built it quietly," I replied. A small, almost reluctant smile touched her lips. Perhaps there's wisdom in that. It wasn't an apology wrapped in poetry, but it was real, and real is enough. 2 seconds.